1945, World War II has just ended, but the world is far from peaceful. In the ruins of Europe, two new superpowers emerge, the United States and the Soviet Union, each carrying vastly different visions for the future. Meanwhile, across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, former colonies are seizing the moment, demanding independence from imperial rule. Welcome back to Gardner's History Garden's AP World History Podcast. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the Cold War and the wave of decolonization that shaped global power structures in the second half of the 20th century. From ideological battles to proxy wars, from the fall of empires to the rise of new nations, we'll uncover how this era set the stage for the modern world. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the major conflicts, key figures, and the impacts of these transformations, not just for history, but for today's geopolitical landscape. Imagine standing in the war-torn streets of Berlin in 1945. On one side, Soviet troops raised the red hammer and sickle flag, claiming their portion of defeated Nazi Germany. On the other, American and British forces consolidate their hold. The war may be over, but a new battle is beginning. One not fought with guns on battlefields, but with spies, propaganda, and political maneuvering. The United States and the Soviet Union had once been uneasy allies against Hitler, but their cooperation was a matter of necessity, not trust. At the heart of their post-war tensions was a fundamental ideological clash: capitalism versus communism. The U.S. promoted free markets and democratic governments, while the USSR fought to expand its communist influence to create a buffer zone of friendly socialist states. The division became particularly painful during post-war negotiations at the Yalta Conference, February of 1945, and Potsdam in July of 1945. Allied leaders debated the fate of Germany and Eastern Europe. While they agreed to divide Germany into occupied zones, deeper tensions surfaced when Stalin pushed for communist rulers in Poland and other Eastern European nations. The result? A world split in two. The U.S. leading the West with democracy and capitalism, and the USSR controlling the East with communism and authoritative rule. A memory trick to remember the origins of the Cold War: think TIRE, T-I-R-E. T for tensions at Yalta and Potsdam. Ideological divide of capitalism and communism. R, the rise of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. E, economic rebuilding efforts. This would be the Marshall Plan versus Soviet control. In 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." This metaphor became a reality as Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, and nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary forced into communist regimes. The United States feared that if communism spread unchecked, it would threaten democracy worldwide. In response, the U.S. announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pleading to support nations resisting communism, starting with Greece and Turkey. This policy of containment aimed to stop communism from spreading rather than rolling it back. At the same time, the U.S. introduced the Marshall Plan, which lasted from 1948 to 1952. This was a massive $13 billion aid package to help rebuild war-torn Western Europe. The goal was simple: a strong Europe would resist communism. Stalin, seeing this as an American attempt to undermine Soviet influence, forced Eastern European countries to reject the aid. The first major test of the Cold War tensions came in Berlin. In 1948, Stalin blockaded access to West Berlin, hoping to starve out the Allied-controlled sector. The U.S. and its allies responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year until Stalin backed down. This event cemented Berlin as a Cold War flashpoint for decades to come. The Cold War was about containment. Think CBI. C, containment with the Truman Doctrine. B, the Berlin blockade and airlift. And I, the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe. The US and USSR never directly fought each other, but their rivalry played out through proxy wars, conflicts where they supported opposing sides. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded the South, prompting a U.S.-led United Nations response. After 3 years of brutal fighting, the war ended in a stalemate at the 38th parallel, where North and South Korea remain divided today. This was the first major test of the U.S. containment policy in Asia. Vietnam was another Cold War battleground as communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought to unify the country. The U.S. backed South Vietnam, fearing a domino effect. If Vietnam fell to communism, so would the rest of Southeast Asia. The war became deeply unpopular in the U.S., and after years of costly fighting, America withdrew in 1973, leading to a communist victory in 1975. In 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan to support a struggling communist government. The U.S. secretly funded Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, making it another proxy conflict. After a decade of resistance, the USSR withdrew in 1989, suffering a defeat often compared to the U.S. experience in Vietnam. These wars weren't just about territory, they were about proving whose system, capitalism or communism, was superior. By the 1950s, the Cold War had become a high-stakes competition of military and technological dominance. The arms race saw both superpowers build up massive nuclear arsenals, leading to the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The idea that nuclear war would destroy both sides, preventing either from striking first. Meanwhile, the space race symbolized Cold War rivalry in space and science and innovation. The USSR shocked the world in 1957 by launching Sputnik, the first satellite. In response, the US created NASA, and in 1969 landed the first humans on the moon with the Apollo 11 mission. Memory trick for Cold War competition: think ass. A, arms race, so your nuclear buildup. S, space race, Sputnik and the moon landing. And S, superpower tensions, so your proxy wars and espionage. Ass. The end of the Cold War. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was struggling, its economy was stagnating, and the cost of maintaining its empire was draining resources. In 1985, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced two key policies: glasnost, openness, which allowed free speech and political reform, and perestroika, which was reconstructing, this was economic reforms to help modernize the USSR. Rather than strengthening the Soviet Union, these reforms exposed its weakness. By 1989, communist governments in the Eastern Europe collapsed, symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, marking the official end of the Cold War. For our final memory trick for this section, think gum. G-U-M. G is Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, and perestroika. U, USSR's economic decline. And M, mass protests and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Cold War wasn't just a battle of weapons, it was a battle of ideas. It shaped global politics, fueled conflicts worldwide, and influenced culture, science, and economics. Understanding its key events, proxy wars, and strategies like containment will help you on the AP exam. While the Cold War raged, another seismic shift was occurring: the dismantling of empires. But what led to this massive global transformation? First, World War II fundamentally weakened European colonial powers. Countries like Britain and France had spent years fighting devastating wars, draining their economies and military strength. Maintaining vast overseas empires became increasingly difficult and costly. At the same time, nationalist movements, which had been growing for decades, gained momentum. These movements were led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi in India, who championed nonviolence resistance, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, who called for Pan-Africa unity and self-determination. People across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean no longer saw colonial rule as inevitable. They demanded independence. The Cold War also played a crucial role. The United States and the Soviet Union, despite their rivalry, both pressured European nations to decolonize, though for different reasons. The U.S. often framed itself as an anti-colonial power, seeking to win influence in newly independent nations. Meanwhile, the USSR promoted revolutionary movements to spread communism ideology. Both superpowers saw decolonialization as an opportunity to gain allies in the global struggle between capitalism and communism. Every region had its own struggles for independence, shaped by its unique history and the response of colonial leaders. Let's look at a few key examples. India and Pakistan in 1947. British India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, but after decades of resistance, independence was finally granted in 1947. Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent movement had played a major role, but independence came at a terrible cost. Religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims led to the partition of India into two countries, India and Pakistan. This division triggered one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in history, with over 15 million people displaced and up to 1 million killed in communal violence. The first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence was Ghana in 1957. Ghana's success inspired a domino effect across the continent. However, not all nations achieved independence peacefully. In Algeria, the struggle against French rule turned into a brutal war from 1954 to 1962, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. The French military used torture, and Algerian revolutionaries responded with bombings and guerrilla warfare. In the end, Algeria gained independence, but the scars of war shaped its future. Southeast Asia also saw intense struggles for independence. Indonesia broke free from Dutch control in 1949 after years of armed resistance. In Vietnam, the battle for independence from French rule turned into a much larger Cold War conflict. After defeating the French in 1954, Vietnam was divided into Communist North Vietnam and U.S.-backed South Vietnam, eventually leading to the Vietnam War, which pulled the United States for over a decade. The process of decolonization was often far from smooth. Even after independence, many nations faced serious challenges that would shape their futures. Winning independence was just the beginning. Many new nations inherited problems created by colonial rule, including arbitrary borders that grouped together rival ethnic and religious groups. In some cases, this led to civil war, such as in Nigeria and Sudan. Economically, independence did not always mean freedom. Many former colonies remained dependent on their old rulers for trade, investment, and resources. This economic reliance, known as neo-colonialism, meant that even after formal independence, European powers and multinational corporations continued to exert control over African, Asian, and Latin American economies. And of course, the Cold War ensued that ensured that newly independent nations became battlegrounds for global influence. The U.S. and USSR often supported rival factions, fueling proxy wars in places like Angola, the Congo, and Afghanistan. The choices that these young nations made, whether to align with capitalism, communism, or attempt neutrality, had often had lasting consequences. Decolonization was one of the most significant shifts in modern history, reshaping the world map and redefining global power structures. Yet, its effects continue to be felt today, from economic inequalities to ongoing political struggles in post-colonial nations. All right, let's wrap up with some quick memory tricks to help you remember key themes from the Cold War and decolonialization. These acronyms, FACE and NICE, will make it easy to recall the big ideas. First up, the Cold War. Just remember FACE, because the Cold War was all about saving face, right? FACE. F is for the fronts. Cold War wasn't a direct war between the US and the USSR. Instead, they fought proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, where each side backed opposing forces. A is for alliances. The world was split into two camps, NATO, led by the US and allies, and the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union. C is for containment. The US aimed to contain communism using policies like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. E is for escalation. The arms race and the space race were key parts in the Cold War, with both sides pushing the limits of military and technological power. Now let's switch gears to decolonization, a process that shook the foundations of empire. Just think nice, because independence is a nice goal, but achieving it wasn't always easy. NICE. N is for nationalism. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi fueled independence movements with powerful nationalist ideas. I is for impacts of World War II. European powers were left weakened and broke after the war, making it harder to hold on to their colonies. C is for conflicts. Independence wasn't always peaceful. Think of the partition of India, which led to mass violence, or the Algerian War, which turned into a brutal fight against French rule. E is for economic struggles. Even after independence, many nations remained financially tied to their former colonizers, a challenge known as neo-colonialism. So remember, FACE for Cold War and NICE for decolonization. As we've seen, the Cold War and decolonization reshaped the global order in ways that still impact the world today. The superpowers were locked in a battle for influence, while former colonies navigated the difficult road to independence, often facing new struggles along the way. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in to episode 8. In our final episode, we'll dive into the forces of globalization and how they've shaped the modern world. Think technology, trade, and the interconnected societies we live in today. Until then, keep up the great work, stay curious, and remember, history is the key to understanding our future. See you next time.